Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding Online. I'm Roland, this is Matt, and today we're looking at your questions for the King video, or the lesson we did on the King. If you're keen to have your questions answered in a video like this, then you just have to ask them during the week that we put them out on the lesson. Every time we put a lesson out on the lesson page, there's a Ask a Question button that allows you to submit questions to us, and then we'll take a look at them here. Okay, Matt, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Let's get going.
Okay, so I think we got three areas of questions, I guess we could call them. Three questions with follow-up questions.
Good.
From your talk. So let's get started. So we can start at the beginning. The beginning of the Bible, not the beginning of your talk. At one point in your talk, you went back to look at Adam and Eve as kings. Now, we've spoken about them as the originals. We spoke about them as priests. We spoke about Eden and the Garden of Eden as a temple. I think it might be newer to people to think about Adam and Eve as kings of something. When you spoke about it, you mentioned that Eden is sort of like the kingdom, if I'm paraphrasing this correctly, whereas the Garden of Eden is the lounge, the resting place for this kingdom. That was kind of interesting. So, but it is a bit surprising, I think, to us who read, at least in our English Bibles. In Genesis 2 verse 15, it says, God put man in the Garden of Eden to work and keep it. So that makes it sound like the garden is something that Adam and Eve would be gardeners of, which doesn't make it really sound like a chill out area, if I can say it that way. So yeah. I don't know if you could maybe just explain that a bit and how that relates to what you were saying.
Yeah, cool. So one of the things that we spoke about in the lesson, and something that we also spoke about back in the lesson that we did on the temple in our first module, is just that distinction between Eden and the garden. So we've got Eden as the more general region, and we've got the garden in particular as this more specific area within Eden. And you see that from the way that the with all the rivers joining up in the way that the garden, or the way that the area is described, is that they're flowing from the garden to water the rest of Eden, and it kind of splits out into all of them. So we've got other indications from the chapter that Eden and the garden are two separate places. But the way that the English is laid out is a little bit less clear than the Hebrew, and I don't say this as an expert on Hebrew. I just say this as somebody who can read Hebrew, who's standing on the shoulders of scholars who do know what they're talking about. So with that disclaimer, it's worth just noticing that in Hebrew, it's one of those languages that has genders. So you've got masculine nouns, you've got feminine nouns. And that'll be reflected in the like a table might be masculine or feminine. Potato might be masculine or feminine. I don't know. And that'll be reflected in the words themselves, or in the pronouns used to talk about those things. So you'd expect that a masculine pronoun would be used for a masculine noun. If garden is a masculine noun, which I think it is in Hebrew, then you'd expect a masculine pronoun to be used to describe garden. But when we get to Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the man and rested him in the Garden of Eden. Garden being a masculine noun, Eden being a feminine noun, and the human is put in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And it, in both those cases, in both the working and the keeping, is a feminine pronoun. So we would expect that to be talking about Eden, not the garden. So it seems like what the author of Genesis is doing is talking somewhat loosely. And since we already know that there are two distinct regions, I think it's reasonable to infer that what he has in mind is that they're going to be working in Eden, and it's just a way of talking a bit more about the general region where the garden is located.
So you have the garden, and then you have Eden outside of that, and then they're working. The scope of that is actually quite bigger than we would think. So is it, out of interest, is it possible then that when Eve spoke to the serpent, that was not in the garden? Like she was like going out into the broader Eden somewhere?
Yeah, good question. And I'm not entirely sure.
But the idea was that the day-to-day life of Adam and Eve would be not just in the garden, not just confined to the garden. They would be
correct
in the broader Eden. Okay.
The garden was where they were meant to find rest and refreshment. That was the lounge. Whereas the more general region of Eden was their workspace. And the word that, I mean, it says in English that they were put in the Garden of Eden. The word used there in Hebrew is rested. It's the word Noach,
Rested, yeah.
which we get the name Noah from. His name was Rest. And we already spoke about in the third lesson of Module 1 on the temple that the way that the area is kind of structured is like a temple. You've got the sort of Holy of Holies with the garden. You've got the holy place with the more general region of Eden. And you've got, I guess, the outer court with the everywhere else surrounding. So what they were doing in that area was sort of priestly work. That's something that you spoke about in lesson 3, and also something we mentioned in passing in the temple lesson. Although that did need a little bit of precision, which I didn't give. It was priestly rather than what I said in the temple talk, that they were acting as priests, because the working and the keeping is a Levitical, something that the Levites are said to do, not so much the priests themselves. But that aside, what they were doing is that sort of priestly duty, and with the snake coming in, that's kind of introducing some sort of uncleanness. So I think it quite possibly could be either Eden or in the garden. Okay. I imagine it's in Eden because that was where they were meant to guard, which is what shamar means, the keeping word.
Yeah, so the same word for keeping, work and keep it, is used later in the Old Testament, and it often gets translated as guard when it's used of the Levites or the priests. Yeah. Yeah,
there we go. So probably in Eden, but preventing the serpent from actually getting into the garden itself. I don't know. I'm speculating.
But Eden itself, in the temple metaphor, would have been a holy place. It would have been like the outer chamber of the temple that we have in Israel.
Yeah.
So I know that some scholars talk about Adam and Eve not necessarily being the only people around. That there would have been other people, and maybe Adam and Eve were meant to like spread out to include them or something like that. And I know, like, sometimes people will point to the fact that Cain was like afraid of other people when they were outside the garden. He's like, where did these other people come from? You know?
Yeah.
So putting that, like, we don't have to debate that question, but it's more like assuming that kind of idea. What would that mean then about Adam and Eve being kingly? Would they have been like the kings over those people, or would the people have been included in that kingliness? Like, how would that have worked?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. With what you kind of hinted at there is one of the difficulties of just assuming that Adam and Eve were the primal couple, that all other humans were born from them, that it kind of originated with them, and that every other human that ever was must have come from them in some way, shape, or form, as their kids. I don't think that's necessarily what the narrative is implying. I think it is hammering on the fact that they were not necessarily the first ever humans, but the first royalty, that they were meant to be God's universal kings over the rest of the humans that were there in existence. So the account in Genesis 2 and 3 isn't so much about origins as it is about ordinations, or anointings, maybe. I don't know if ordination is the right word for a king. Maybe it could be. I don't know. Ordination to some sort of service. I don't know. We'd have to look that up. So yeah, that's kind of how they're being portrayed there. And coming back to what we were talking about with the garden where they were rested and Eden as that general area, one of the things that I mentioned in the lesson is that that's a usual trope that we find in ancient Near Eastern portrayals of kings, the way the kings are spoken about, that they live in their that's a related point, but they live in their comfortable garden. They live in their palace that overlooks the place where they work. That's what I'm trying to say. It kind of overlooks these gardens, and the way that's portrayed as a temple where the kings live as well is also part of that picture. But all of that kind of coming together to show that they are royalty. That's what it's wanting to hammer on. That's what it's wanting us to notice about Adam and Eve, not necessarily that they were the first ever people. It does say in Genesis 1 that God created humans to have dominion. I think that maybe is in the same sort of way that we might talk about the priests in Israel being chosen specifically from the tribe of Levi for that particular service. But at the same time, you've got the nation of Israel, which were meant to be a kingdom of priests as a more general collective now, including everybody from all tribes. So maybe there's a similar sort of thing going on there, where humanity was meant to be God's image bearers as the ones who were exercising God's dominion on his behalf and ruling an ordered creation, but that under a single person who was there to head up the operation in some sense.
So that would have been Adam and then Eve. Adam
and Eve together, I guess. Yeah. That royal couple.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you about next, was the idea of us having dominion as humans. Okay, but cool. There you go. Okay, I think that sort of sums up our first question, that area around Adam and Eve and sort of thinking about their royalty.
Just to throw in there before we move on, the paper that I found the most helpful was Michael Lefebvre's. It's one that I've mentioned before. It's called Adam Reigns in Eden. So if you've got a more scholarly bent and you want to check that out, then I would highly recommend it. Very helpful.
Do we have a link to that on the lesson page, or is it available online?
It is on the lesson page. We'll also put it in the description below of the YouTube video.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question now, zooming forward all the way to the New Testament with Jesus.
Skip a couple hundred years.
Yeah. So we spoke about, in the talk, you spoke about him taking on this title of the Son of Man, which we saw came from Daniel. We'll get back to Daniel in a second, but just talking about Jesus' use of this title, the Son of Man. It's quite a weird title. Like, he refers to himself as the Son of Man throughout the Gospels, throughout his ministry. But, later we refer to him as the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ. Those terms aren't new. It's not like we came up with those terms. Those terms come from the Old Testament as well. So I guess could you maybe say a few things about, the question is, could you say a few things about why Jesus would use the title Son of Man more than those other, what we could say, more Christian titles, if you could say it like that?
Yeah. Well, certainly later on, and I think this comes out in the lesson, that what Jesus is wanting us to see is that he's the fulfillment of that Daniel prophecy. That one like a Son of Man that Daniel saw ascending to the throne of the Ancient of Days, that one like a Son of Man who was given glory, honor, power, dominion, this somewhat divinely portrayed figure. We're meant to see that that's Jesus. I think that was very intentional on Jesus' part in the way that he spoke about himself, certainly in his trial, which we saw in Matthew's Gospel, where he says, you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and approaching the mighty one. The high priest knew exactly what Jesus was saying. That it was a very clear paraphrase of that Daniel vision, and he tore his clothes and said, "This is blasphemy. Come on, you've now heard him. Get rid of him." But Jesus does talk about himself consistently in that way all the way through, at least in calling himself the Son of Man, which was probably just him being strategic. He calls himself something that's vague enough not to get him into trouble, but loaded enough that when the key moment comes, it takes on this whole significance that we're meant to read with all the connotations that come with it in Daniel. Ezekiel's called Son of Man. Job is called Son of Man. It was obviously some turn of phrase that was common enough in that time. That
Would
Jesus
it be
just took on board.
in the Hebrew? Would it be son of Adam? Is that what it would be, or is man something different? Okay, yeah. So yeah, it could just be referring to, in terms of like what it could be referring to as in its full range. It could just be referring to like a human, like some descendant of Abraham or something.
Yeah.
Sorry, some descendant of Adam.
Yeah.
Okay, so then as he gets towards the end, he kind of makes it more explicit that he is referring to the particular Son of Man that was spoken of in Daniel, that has that very exalted role.
Yeah, I guess we could talk about Son of Man in more general terms as just a way of talking about human. But you could also talk about the Son of Man in that more specific way. And Jesus is being a little bit ambiguous all the way through until the end, where he really comes out and just says it. But now that we know that he says it later on, we can kind of go back to the earlier accounts and say, okay, well, maybe actually what he's saying here is something a little bit more loaded. And that's a whole area of study that New Testament scholars have gone down that I don't know enough about to say anything.
Something similar, I guess, could be said of the Son of God and the Christ. But I suppose those were... Because Son of God is just a title for king, right? Like David is called the Son of... Oh, you mentioned that, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
The descendant from David is called the Son of God, or God will be his father, and so on.
Yeah,
but I guess those tend to be more loaded terms. They tend to be used less frequently of like your average Joe.
Yeah, totally. What I did say was that in the ancient Near East, that was common enough that the king was seen as sort of the son of the deity in some sense. That was also very much true in New Testament times as well. So Caesar would have been understood, or would have seen himself as the son of God in some sense, or son of the gods, or however it was for him. So by Jesus claiming to be son of God, or by claiming that Jesus is son of God, it's not only that they'd be claiming that Jesus is king, but that Jesus is king and not Caesar, which would have been a hugely political claim in that time.
Is something similar? That's similar to like the word Lord in the New Testament, right? Like Kyrios is used of an exalted figure. Is that true? Or
I would imagine so.
Okay, cool.
I think it probably parallels the way that we use the word Lord. We kind of use the word Lord as a sort of more exalted figure, I guess.
Okay,
I don't know. I don't have any great insights on the word Lord.
It is interesting because I think, well, that comment you just made, because I think just in terms of how we tend to think of religion these days, we tend to want to have politics in one area and religion in another area. But here we see this. I mean, we're not trying to politicize religion or anything, but it's to say that this religion that we believe or follow isn't like, it also encompasses everything. It encompasses like the ruling powers of the world and so on.
Yeah. I think that's the claim of Jesus in the New Testament, that it isn't just Jesus is Lord over this particular area of your life that you can take or leave. Jesus is Lord over everything. Jesus is king and has claim on everything. And it's not a matter of take it or leave it. It's a matter of whether he'll take or leave you. And that depends on your allegiance in some sense. Whether or not you'll accept his reign and his rule.
I suspect it's quite easy for us to keep that distinction in mind because we don't often have kings these days. We have presidents or prime ministers or something. And so it's easy for us to be like, yeah, the king is a very like religious term that we can sort of demarcate from our government. But in the original context it was heard, it was like, well, you had, an emperor, a king, and now Jesus is claiming to be king. And so it's like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, totally. The implications of that are loaded, and we don't need to go into that. But it is a huge claim that Jesus is making, and we do need to hear it today.
So, okay, now picking up on that Son of Man title, but from a different angle, if we go back to that Daniel passage, you spoke a bit about that in the talk, and I think some people will be a bit surprised to hear what you said there about the Son of Man. I think we're used to, in our sermons or in our own reading of the Gospels and so on, we're used to thinking of the Son of Man as like clearly like referring to like a singular figure, kind of like the Davidic king or the Messiah or the Christ or something. But when you were talking about the Daniel passage, you were saying it's kind of got like, it kind of refers to a singular as well as a group of people. And then that actually comes through into the New Testament where it like refers to Jesus primarily, but then also could be referring to the church. I don't know if you could maybe just like say a bit more about that, or like sort of encapsulate briefly how that works. I think that would have been quite a new idea for people.
No, totally. I think I was very much, I very much sympathize with that, because I kind of came to the passage, I kind of came to Daniel 7 expecting, cool, there will be a nice, straightforward, messianic, here's the Son of Man. If we're ever going to play a game of Spot the Jesus, here's the time to do it. And the passage just doesn't let us. And I think the misconception comes in because we like to read the first half of the chapter, but in the second half of the chapter, things get weird. So we kind of leave that, and I'll come back to that another day.
When you say first and second half, do you mean the vision and then the explanation of the vision?
That's correct, yeah. So in the first half of the chapter, the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind. He was lying in bed, and he wrote down the substance of his dream. And so then he goes and details the dream. Daniel said in the vision, and he goes through, he saw a whole lot of monsters of various kinds. The fourth was the most scary, and it had this crazy horn that was doing weird things. But while I was thinking about those horns, Daniel says, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which was very proud. And as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. His hair was, the hair of his head was white like wool. And there's this description of this divine-like figure. And as he was watching, there was one like a son of man who approached the Ancient of Days, who came up to the throne and was given authority and dominion. The monsters are judged by God and dealt with. And this one like a son of man is given authority to rule and to... Great. We've got this new humanity. I think that the Genesis connotations are worth picking up there, that there's this sort of chaos and disorder and this perverse creation, the way that I think Greg Beale explained it. And then once that's all kind of been brought to order, you've got this new human figure who's set there to now rule over the now ordered creation, which really just makes us think of the creation account in Genesis. That's the vision. Then Daniel goes on to explain the vision. He's given an interpretation. So from verse 15, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached the one who was standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. And from verse 16, the second half of verse 16 onwards, the vision's explained. And we've got the beasts who... the beasts who represent kingdoms in opposition to God, particularly that fourth kingdom that spoke very boastfully and was very proud and ended up getting slammed by God. And so that's how things are kind of unfolding, and just where we expect the Son of Man to be interpreted, just when we're kind of expecting him to say now, and then the Son of Man figure means this. He doesn't explicitly say that, but we're introduced to somebody that we're introduced to a group of people that we haven't met yet, which is the holy people of God. That's in verse 25, Daniel 7:25. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people. This is the beast speaking against God and oppressing God's holy people. to try to change the set times and the laws. And the holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times and half a time. But then there will be that judgment, then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under the heaven will be handed over to. We expect the Son of Man, because that's who it was handed over to in the vision itself. But no, it's handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. Okay, in the vision we saw a bunch of beasts and then a Son of Man, singular. In the interpretation, we saw a bunch of beasts who we now know represent kingdoms and people. So that's the parallel that we're seeing here. That there's the kind of the dream and the meaning, and what we see is that the Son of Man must be representing these this collective. What I was wanting to bring out in the lesson is that we've got a bunch of clues to see that it's not mere representation. The idea of representation isn't a foreign idea to us. We see that with the kings of Israel, that the king is a sort of representative of the broader group of people, and the fate of that people is bound up with the faithfulness of the king, or lack thereof in a lot of cases. That actually there are a bunch of clues to say that, yes, there's that, but also this individual figure. We see that from the way that he's spoken about. So you might want to just go back to the lesson and listen to that part again. The way that the figure is spoken about in the vision, and then the way that both of them are spoken about in the interpretation. The sovereignty and power of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to, plural, the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom, singular, will be an everlasting kingdom, and the rulers will worship and obey him, singular. So there's this implication.
In the Daniel text itself, there's this like, oh, okay, sorry. What you're saying is in the Daniel text itself, there's this like two ways of speaking about the Son of Man figure that was in the vision. One in terms of a collective, and one in terms of a singular.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of, it's not really teased out exactly how that's supposed to work, but the intuitive way to think about it is as a ruler over a people.
Yeah. I would think so. So we're kind of given both and just expected to wrestle with it. But yeah, I think that's what's going on. I think it is both and we're waiting to see how exactly that's going to work out. But the other reason that I think we should be thinking of an individual, and the reason that I think we do, at least in part, get to map it onto Jesus later on, is that in chapter 9, we're introduced to an anointed one, a singular figure who's going to be pioneering the restoration of God's kingdom, which I can only imagine is building on what we saw in chapter 7.
It is interesting in terms of, if you think about that in the New Testament, how you have a similar duality, I don't know if that's the right word to use for it, with Jesus and the church. So, he's the king, he's the ruler, he's the Lord, yes. But then sometimes he's spoken of as like the first among brothers and sisters, right? So, Romans 8 will talk about us being co-heirs with him. Hebrews 2 or 3 will talk about him being the trailblazer that we follow after him. And so you have that similar thing where it's like he's part of a collective, but he's also the defining feature of the collective and the ruler over the collective.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not like completely foreign to the New Testament that you have that, I don't want to call it ambiguity, but like that sort of both and way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of language of Paul in Romans and a bunch of other places where all the things that were true of Jesus become true of his people by virtue of being included in Jesus, that language of in Christ that I think really pervades the second big section of Romans, chapters 5 to 8. And I think...
Yeah,
no, go for it.
It was interesting in your talk, I can't remember where you quoted from, but it was one of the Gospels. They kind of make that subtle connection of this Daniel Son of Man figure to Jesus' disciples. Is that right?
Maybe.
Am I misremembering something? It was near the Ascension. Oh no.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
this is really cool. This is really, really cool. In Acts, in Acts 1 verse 6, the disciples say to Jesus, "Is this the time? Is God finally doing what he said he was going to do all along and reestablishing his kingdom? Is this the time where the kingdom will be restored to Israel?" And Jesus is like, hang on a second. But that question frames what he's about to say. "Then you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You will be given power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you." Think again for a second just how the Holy Spirit is actually connected with royalty in other parts of Scripture. Say in Isaiah, where the Spirit comes on the royal figure in Isaiah 11, in the promised Davidic king. The way that the Spirit comes on on David when he's anointed by Samuel. It isn't the only time the Spirit is coming on people, but one of the key times that the Spirit actually comes upon people in the Old Testament is connected with royalty and connected with being God's chosen king. So the Spirit comes on all of God's people. Then Jesus goes up. He disappears in a cloud, which should make us think of the one who was riding the cloud up to the Ancient of Days, and who is given. Let me just find the verse here. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Then he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. And he's given an everlasting dominion. What happens in Acts 2? The disciples speak, and people from all sorts of different languages hear and understand the message that Jesus is king. And that actually they need to submit to him. Dude, it's Daniel. It's the Son of Man passage. And the disciples are participating in that Son of Man mission and that Son of Man reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never heard of that before. So that was awesome to see that work out, that ambiguity work its way out into how Jesus and the church work together, or the disciples work together. Yeah, I always thought the Son of Man, Daniel figure language was consigned to the Gospels.
Yeah.
But there it's breaking out into the early church, and it's really cool to see that. Cool. That's all the time we have for questions on the King. So if you're watching this and you're keen to ask a question about our next talk, which will be coming out tomorrow, then get your questions in during the week, and we'll answer them in our Q&R that'll come out next Monday. And that'll be the last one for this module. So we've gone through 4 talks already, 4 talks and Q&A videos. So you can get access to those on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, as well as on our website that has all the links to those. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you tomorrow for our lesson on the servant.